Everyone's connecting. There we go. Thank you, Seema. All right. Welcome, welcome, everybody. We are here for Collective Minds community conversation on philanthropy and networks. I hope you're in the right place. Welcome. We'll just give it another 30 seconds. I think maybe a couple more people are rolling in, connecting their sound. Hopefully you can all hear me properly. I'll ask that you keep yourself muted unless you're speaking, just so we can minimize the background noise. You can feel free to have your video on or off as you prefer. All right, so again, welcome, and I'm so pleased to have you here. I'm Kirsten Tebby. I'm the founder of Collective Minds. I'm your host for this session, let's say, which I'm really, really excited about. We have an amazing panel here to talk about this topic. So again, you're here for the community conversation on philanthropy and networks, and just so excited for this. Just a bit of background and introductions, and then we will move into a panel discussion. So if you are not already familiar with Collective Mind, we are very happy to have you here. Collective Mind is all about networks. Our focus is on helping networks and the people who work for and with networks to be more effective and impactful. So we work on both of those sides. We work directly with networks, sometimes through their donors, to help them with consulting, advisory, various tools like our network capacity assessment, network diagnostic framework, supporting networks directly. And we also provide, such as this session, various learning and professional development opportunities for people who are working for and with networks, presumably like many of you. So that is a little bit about Collective Mind. We think about networks as organizing models that bring together people and or organizations who have common interests and want to work together to achieve shared goals. That was a lot, but that's our view of networks, these organizing models that bring people together to work towards shared goals, right? And that is the focus, the lens through which we're going to have this conversation about philanthropy today. So I'm going to give our panelists a second to introduce themselves. And as I'm doing that, I would love to have each of you who's on the line to do the same in the chat. So if you could, in the chat, just say hello, where you are, your name, if you work for a network or a donor or some other organization, you want to share that, that would be great. And if you also, per the topic of discussion today, want to share something about an experience you've had or something that comes up for you around interacting with philanthropic organizations or foundations, we'd love to hear that too. So if you, again, would like to just say hello with a brief introduction in the chat, that would be great. And we will get started. So I'm going to, oh, got a weird bit of noise there. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, I got a weird noise and then I was muted. Okay, so again, introducing ourselves in the chat, and I'm going to hand it off to our three panelists to introduce themselves. And in fact, let me just say that you have all the proper information. I realized I didn't share my screen here, and maybe you would like to know specifically who these folks are. So let me just do that. Technical difficulty. We've got some introductions in the chat. That's great, everybody. Okay, so we are here for our community conversation on philanthropy and networks. And this is our panel. So if we could go through panelists, whoever would like to go first, Heather or Hilesh or Katie, and just say hello, introduce yourselves, and a little bit about what you do that relates to this topic. And then we will move into an overview of the format for this session and move straight into this discussion.
I'll go ahead and jump in. Hi, I'm Heather
Great.
Hamilton. I am Executive Director of the Elevate Children Funders Group, which is a network of funders who support more and better funding for children, particularly those facing adversity and the most marginalized and vulnerable. And my background in all of this is actually, I have a very long career in supporting networks and coalitions, heading up, building, getting them to work on issues of advocacy on genocide. But I also came into this having been executive director of the Connect US Fund, which was a pooled fund of many of the large US funders, Ford, Mott, Rockefeller, there are about 7 of them, who came together to create a pot of money to support collaboration towards more effective US global engagement. And this was during the Bush years. And while they were supporting collaborative projects, they also supported a network as well. So we actually, as the fund, built a network of foreign policy professionals in Washington, DC, and funded collaboration. And so in trying to collaborate or trying to coordinate a network of funders, and then previously having worked specifically with funders interested in networks, I have interesting points of view of the different places that funders intersect, even as members of the network in the current situation.
Great, thank you, Heather. I'm so happy to have you here. Oops.
I can jump in.
Well, yes, please.
I'm Katie Davies. I'm Program Manager of the Strategic Networks Initiative at Ignite Philanthropy. Ignite Philanthropy is a donor collaborative fund working to support the field to end violence against children. My background kind of personally is in children's rights philanthropy as well. Kind of as a program officer within a private foundation, I've kind of worked in a donor advisory role as well, and then more recently in this role, kind of within kind of more of an intermediary kind of function, and I've worked with kind of partners, I guess, from the grassroots up to the global level. This current role and initiative at Ignite, the Strategic Networks Initiative, is really aimed at supporting kind of some of the field's core anchor networks, partnerships and alliances. And we provide kind of a range of different supports, but in particular looking at convening groups, kind of convening network leaders to build and strengthen connectivity between them, but also kind of strengthen network effectiveness through peer engagement and learning. So yeah, I'll pause there for now. Thanks, Kirsten.
Great, thanks, Katie. Hilesh, please.
I'll round this out. So hi, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I am Hilesh Patel. I'm with the Field Foundation. We are a hyper-local Chicago-based philanthropic foundation that used to have 2 different arms, one in Chicago and one in New York. Now we're primarily dedicated to Chicago. We center racial equity through community empowerment through 3 main program areas: justice, art, and media and storytelling, or journalism, and leadership investment. And so one of the things that we do primarily is kind of focus on supporting a lot of organizations that are doing organizing, that are doing grassroots efforts in and around Chicago and the 6 collar counties around. I have a strange background. I come from a little bit of everything: social service, education, educational activism, organizing, anti-racist work, community programming. So I came into philanthropy with a little bit of knowledge picked from all areas. And what I currently do is I run a leadership or oversee a leadership award with the MacArthur Foundation, where we honor and recognize grassroots leaders working across those program areas in Chicago. And one of the things that we found out, one of the things that permeates a lot of the work, is how much distributed leadership, collaboration, collective models, and networks are part of leadership discussions and how people are practicing leadership nowadays. And so part of what that does for Field is Field Foundation is really emphasizing a lot of work in supporting those broader networks and figuring out what it means to actually kind of turn the money over to them and give them the support and the trust. I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Hilesh, and Heather and Katie for those introductions. And thanks also to everyone who has putting your own introduction in the chat. So just a brief word on format, and then we're going to jump into this discussion because I think there is a lot to say. So we will have about 20-25 minutes of our panelists, who you just heard introduce themselves, having a discussion amongst themselves. You are welcome to also share your questions in the chat. We will try to get to some of those either in this first panel discussion or later in the session. So after this 20 to 25 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists, we will do about 5 minutes in breakout groups, just for you to have a chance to meet one another, say hello, share some reflections with each other. Then we'll come back and use the remainder of the time to have a full group discussion and Q&A. And again, we'll hope to get to as many of those questions that you may put in the chat as possible. So let's get this started. And again, thank you so much, Hilesh, Heather, and Katie, for being here today. I'm so excited and interested to hear everything you have to say. No pressure. So let's start off. Can you start by talking about some of the basics of philanthropy, some of the key concepts and principles that you think networks should know about foundation structures and dynamics, mindsets of boards, approaches to decision-making, or anything else? Let's start there, shall we?
I can start us off with something that just happened super early this morning, and then maybe I'll give context to it, and then Heather and Katie can we can all just have a dialogue. One of the things that we were having a conversation about this morning with about half of the board is around risk, and what does risk mean in terms of funding organizations or taking chances on organizations. We take chances on a lot of organizations that have small operating budgets, whether they're an actual organization, they're collective, or they're a network. And so the idea of risk comes up a lot. So for example, this morning, there was a collection of 3 organizations that are doing immigration work in Chicago, but also doing policy-based work across Illinois. And their operating budget is $125,000 because they have individual organizational operating budgets, but together that's their operating budget. And so they're asking for $75,000. And so the board's conversation this morning was, well, we feel a little uneasy around giving someone this amount of money. Now we can debate the merits of that, but what is really interesting is having conversations with our board, which is a mixture of more conservative, more like fiscally conservative and more non-fiscally conservative members, around what does risk mean, and how do you attach that to mission alignment and programming. And so those are fascinating conversations for me, because you have program officers who are driving the work, who are on the ground talking to people and understanding what they're doing and saying, like, we know the work and we're kind of advocating for the work, and then it gets pushed back to the board, and the board is looking at sometimes a very small frame with budget, with like yearly numbers, and with a little bit of like the project. And so you're having these conversations around that frame. And so that's how I was thinking a little bit about philanthropy this morning in particular, but I can definitely dive in a little bit more, but I just want to start us off.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Hilesh, because that makes me think about how before I worked in philanthropy, I didn't really have a good sense of how foundations even work, and that there are so many different types of foundations. You can have a community foundation or a family foundation or an individual donor who has their own foundation. But when you think about who's making decisions, with the exception of the community foundation, and for the most part, it's people who've made a lot of money, right? And they haven't necessarily made money by making social change. And so when you think about that structure in which these are the folks who are saying, here's the big picture philanthropic goal I want to achieve, like let's say end childhood hunger. And this is how, and they go to their team and they say, tell me how we should do this. And so they ask program officers or experts or program directors to say, what's this strategy we're going to use? And then that goes back up to the board. And then there's a strategy that a program officer has to follow, right? They're told what to fund, how to fund it. And they have very different levels of instruction, right? Foundation to foundation. Some program officers have quite a bit of latitude. others don't. Some, they just have to fund what they're told. And the number of times I've been in conversation with someone who's like, it's a really great idea, you should fund it. And I'm like, I literally cannot. And it's that kind of like pitching a program officer on something that is not even in their mandate is like one of the biggest things that makes program officers absolutely nuts. Like, I can't do it, even if I think it's great. And so really getting into like how philanthropy works has that cascading effect on understanding of networks. Because when you place networks and the work of a network, which is a bit amorphous and it's based on quite a bit of risk if you're looking at it from a business point of view, and a situation of contribution, but not attribution, like you can't say A led to B led to C, doesn't necessarily fall within the concepts of how boards think change happens. And so there's some education, I think, overall that has been happening over time. There have been a lot of great resources out there, but there's often that education is coming up from level to level to level to level. And so even if you've got a program officer who's like, yeah, I really get networks, that person is not the only person who has to be convinced within private philanthropy, at least. And so there are some structural things about philanthropy that I think make it really hard to shift understandings of how to create social change and where networks and movements fit within that.
Let me jump in here. I think something that you mentioned there, the sort of structure of philanthropy, I think is something I've been thinking a lot about recently as well. In particular, kind of the structures that exist within sort of the funding mechanisms, you know, and to what extent that kind of sparks choices within networks that actually would otherwise not be made. So I'm thinking particularly around, you know, if you think about kind of a typical RFP and the kind of eligibility criteria, like how often is that a requirement that there's a sort of registered entity in place? And I've been sort of thinking a lot recently about kind of this term networks and really kind of how, I don't think philanthropy only, but I think philanthropy is quick to try and make sense of it by kind of packaging it in a way that kind of fits what we will, you know, fits what we understand, and which is organizations, right? So it's how do we kind of expand the conversation in a way that and really kind of, I think, reflect on some of these, you know, legal requirements that exist, but actually kind of a lot of these structural considerations are actually self-imposed as well, I think, often within philanthropy. So I think there's a lot of work for philanthropic entities to do in kind of dismantling some of that and in really kind of revisiting where there's flex and actually how we support in a way that's most conducive to sort of networks and systems change. I don't know if either of you kind of, yeah.
I was just going to add, and I just to, you know, make sure we say it out loud, that to everyone in the room, philanthropy is not only weird, it's also highly problematic and with a deeply colonial past. So I want to acknowledge that, you know, that we're talking about this, but that there's an enormous power dynamic, you know, that it's framed as a binary, that there are people doing work, really good work, and that they're asking for money from philanthropy, and philanthropy is saying yes or no. And it's established in this very kind of dated power dynamic. And I think one of the things I just wanted to add is a lot of what's shifting philanthropy are the organizations and the program officers. And I think it's that collaboration between the organizations and the program officers. Like there's a lot of, you know, this idea of networks, this idea of even like when you're talking about leadership, for example, if you're talking about, well, we're not just talking about one leader, we're talking about 3 people within an organization, 4 people within an organization, sharing responsibilities and thinking about mission differently. Philanthropy writ large is getting shifted because people outside of philanthropy are like, we're thinking differently. And then they're talking to the program officers, many of whom are getting shifted in their thinking or are coming from those fields. And then, you know, and then ultimately shifting the board, you know, and I realize that there's a hierarchical dimension to all this, but I just wanted to acknowledge that out loud, that there's more, you know, it is changing.
And I think, Hilesh, it's also, it's hierarchical and it's also quite elitist. And it's the question of who has knowledge and can inform. So along with a lot of the conversations around shifting the power, there's, it's not just about shifting the power to communities in terms of, say, participatory grant making, right? Or understanding networks. It's kind of who defines the problem in the first place, right? And if the problems are being defined by very, very tiny groups of people who have huge resources, that in itself can be problematic. So part of what I think is most exciting about this time right now is there is, with the shifting the power conversation, and a separate recognition in philanthropy that the biggest changes over our time have required movements, right? There's a lot of the interest in philanthropy is shifting to, okay, how do we support movements? Even if we can't like fund a network per se, how do we actually conceive of where we do or we are able to fund in the context of movement building, in the context of social movements. And I think that the networks conversation really fits into the movement conversation in terms of field catalysts. Like you need the field, we call them network weavers, right? We need the people who are actually doing that selfless leadership work, but not out there being what is traditionally seen as leaders. And I think helping folks within philanthropy understand who those people are and the role that they play and why the networks that they're working with are really critical. It sometimes is an organization, sometimes informal, is one of the things that folks from the community side can be doing.
Hilesh, picking up on that really, I was wondering, tell us a little bit more about the leadership aspect of your work and kind of how you're, I guess, how you're assessing, what types of skills and competencies are you looking for in you described there, you can around more dispersed leadership models. How are you thinking about that internally?
Yeah, so one of the things, so when I was brought on, I was asked to build a leadership program, and we had gotten it was one of the first collaborations between two philanthropic organizations in Chicago, and then also nationally. And so we had partnered with the MacArthur Foundation around, they're well known in the world for doing their MacArthur Genius grants. Well, there was a lot of talk on like, what would it mean to do hyperlocal grants and hyperlocal awards? And so I came in, I built this award, and it was great. We launched it out of the gate in 2019, and we identified 14 leaders working in justice, art, and media and storytelling. A really great group of folks. And then, of course, when you're the person building it, you see all the cracks, and you're like, what are we learning from the process? And what we learned from the process is that the way philanthropy is defining leadership and the way that community organizations and the world outside of philanthropy is defining leadership was imbalanced, and we needed to kind of restructure a lot of things. So Katie, when you were asking that question, one of the things that's come up consistently through this awards process every single year is a lot of people putting in nominations saying, I'm gonna nominate someone individually, but you have to understand that this person is part of like a larger movement, and I want to nominate them so that they bring attention to the larger movement. One of the organizations that I can talk about is Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. If you're in Chicago, you know a lot about the police torture and police accountability connected to a specific officer and the torture that happened with the Chicago Police Department. A lot of people are doing work around that. And there's no one leader, it's a group of like 32 people across, they're pulled from different sections and they're all doing organizing. And so one of the people who got the award last year was from this organization, but she came forward and said, I'll take the award, but with the very clear understanding that I needed to acknowledge that this is part of everyone. We had another person who was nominated and almost got the award, and they declined the award, because their organization's model is like, we don't privatize we don't privilege leadership. And so this year, we announced the awards a little while ago, but this was the first year that we had multiple people nominated for one award, with the very clear, we have a leadership model where there are 4 people doing this work, and we want to nominate all of them for one award. And so this is really pushing us in a fantastic way to start thinking about, what does leadership mean? how do we educate boards, and our board in particular, around distributed leadership, collective and collaborative models, and what does this mean to larger movement building and movement organizations, not just in the city, but across kind of nationally around a multiplicity of topics. I hope that kind of brought a little bit more frame.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the reason I ask, it's something we're sort of thinking a lot about at the minute internally as well, of kind of what would a kind of potential kind of leadership program look like, and how, but almost kind of often the kind of examples that kind of get brought forward are kind of, you know, that, like you say, that kind of more one person at the top type model. And it's how you kind of shift that thinking really around what this could look like and what that means for any kind of given program, I guess.
Ella Baker, Ella Baker seems to be like the person that comes up all the time, in Chicago in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that it makes me think that I used to work for Girls Not Brides, which was the global partnership to end child marriage, and a network of now something like 1,400 organizations worldwide, most of which are community-based. And the chair of our board of trustees was a princess, and she'd get nominated for all sorts of awards. And we'd be forced to go back, particularly from foundations, right? And we'd have to go back and say, like, okay, but it's not going to her. And it's very, very similar. And I do think that this question of leadership is really critical, because the kind of leadership that really makes a network hum is not the visible kind of leadership that tends to get rewarded. And I think it's great that your foundation is really thinking about that quite critically. And how do we acknowledge the different types of leadership out there, and that there are multiple people involved in any even very small change. It's fantastic.
I feel like one of the questions that Katie asked I didn't answer, but Heather, now that you said that, it makes me think about our rubric for, you know, how do we look at leadership and how do we kind of disseminate it and disaggregate it, is we made a rubric based on conversations we had with leaders, and based on conversations we had with the community, with all these organizations. And they were very clear, like, if you're going to be looking at leadership, you have to look at what people are doing internally and making sure they're matching it what they're doing externally. Like if someone's saying we are doing advocacy work around, immigration reform, or we're going to do advocacy around a specific issue, but we have a really frayed and kind of problematic internal system, that is problematic. And so, if someone's talking about community, but they live like, 7 hours away and they're not working in the community, what does that look like? And so this really pushed, I think this is really interesting too, as we're talking about networks. And when we're trying to do education, there's the issue, there's like the funding, but then there's the larger education of how do you change the foundation inside, and say, like, we are going to do some more education around, like, do you understand the difference between movement, collective, networks? Like, do you understand all these words, and how can we better inform you around all of that?
We actually had quite a bit of that role when I was at the Connect US Fund, because we were an intermediary funding coalitions or collaborative networks or what have you, however they were defining themselves. And our 5 to 7 source funders were saying, well, how are you measuring the impact of these grants all the time to us? And how are you measuring the impact of this network? And we finally ended up going to them and saying, look, what we're going to end up doing is working with an expert because it was all around advocacy. These are advocacy coalitions or networks or tables. And we're going to actually work with an external evaluator who will meet with them, help them determine their collective advocacy goals and benchmarks for how they're getting there. Because we all know that you're not going to, in a year's funding, achieve massive advocacy goals. And even if you do, it's probably not just you. And this guy is going to actually walk them through making their work stronger and report back to us on how it goes as a whole, so we have a sense of impact. But you're not going to see, because we are funding coalitions, you're not going to see A led to B led to C, because it literally doesn't work that way. And we actually had like a half a day overview at a planning retreat with the program officers, with the consultant, to walk them through the process and why we couldn't just say giving money to this one coalition on this one issue was going to lead to the policy change within a year.
I think that measurement piece is so interesting, and that I'm reminded of a conversation we had with our kind of partners recently, that they were essentially saying that there needs to be a kind of realignment within the funder community of what is exactly what you're describing, Heather, like what's realistic to expect from complex networked organizations in terms of the type of impact that can be reported. Because I think what happens otherwise is you unintentionally perhaps kind of pushing, I don't know, that there's this kind of potential to kind of oversimplify or kind of, and I think I wonder if that's a little bit of a, I don't know, it kind of is self-perpetuating issue in some ways, because it doesn't allow for kind of space for those conversations to happen.
And it's oversimplify or overclaim impact, I think, as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think I can't remember where I heard this, but there was this hilarious thing where once like some advocacy change within a given country was claimed as like had happened by about like 4 or 5 different networks, 10 organizations, you know, everyone was claiming it as their victory, I guess. And actually it's, yeah, the shift really that's needed to collectively, I think, but particularly kind of recognizing that the power that donors do have in setting that kind of change in motion, I suppose, in terms of expectations. I guess the other thing I'm curious about is, and Heather, you might have insight from your, and Hilesh as well in relation to your work, but I'm wondering how much of, like, particularly in the UK, we're seeing a lot of shift towards funders towards place-based models, and that kind of localization piece happening kind of more broadly, kind of internationally as well. And I'm wondering how much of that is in part because of a shift in people's thinking around systems and recognizing kind of the complexity of these pieces, but while also wanting to, you know, kind of, and recognizing, I guess, that there's, it's easier to do that if you're focused on maybe, you know, one city as opposed to kind of a broader kind of geographical space. I don't know, Heather, you also work globally and regionally, so I'd be interested.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. I think there's a lot of movements towards seeking scale, right? A massive interest among funders, particularly my members, in systems change. And we actually ended up doing right before lockdown, in fact, a training on measuring systems change for our member foundations, right? Like for the program officers, because that they're also struggling with, how do we measure this? Like, how do we understand that impact? And it's still the number one thing that they want to work on, is how, because I think there's this understanding that we can't just keep throwing small bits of money at huge problems. And these are relatively small bits of money. Like, foundations have a ton of money, but compared to all the other money out there from governments, and just in general, like, these are relatively small amounts of money on very big issues. So if you want to see impact at scale, meaning not just impact as in scaling and innovation for a government to pick it up, but actual like broad systems change and how people think and how the world works, understanding that causal chain and being able to measure it is critically important. But I think they're still very much asking themselves these questions. And that, again, is something where ideas and evidence coming up from their grantees, I think, would be incredibly welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna pause us right here. This is an absolutely thrilling conversation. I'm learning so much myself. We're gonna shift gears a little bit. We're going to take 5 minutes in breakout groups amongst yourselves, just to say hello and share your reflections on what you've heard so far. Again, we'll be quick, 5 minutes, quick introductions, first reflections on everything that's been shared, which was a lot. I've been taking lots of notes here. And then we'll come back and we'll continue the conversation, and we'll have you all add your thoughts and questions into it as well. So let's move into, again, about 5 minutes of breakout groups, and then we'll come back and re-kick off this conversation. So we'll see you in a couple minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope that was of interest, that you spoke to someone who was nice and thoughtful and reflective, and that you had a good little opportunity to make a connection. So we are back, and we have our panelists at the ready to answer some questions or continue discussing. If there are thoughts, questions, reflections, anything that's coming up for you, whatever came up for you from your perhaps breakout group or anything else, happy to have you share either in the chat or if you want to unmute and share. And thank you, Heather, for responding with the evaluator. So as per the question in the chat a little bit ago, who would like to ask a question or share a reflection?
Well, I can start.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Carolina. I'm worked as a consultant for different projects in museums mainly, and like looking for community outreach as well for partners to fund the projects that we have in mostly small museums. And one of the reflections that we have had is just, especially for when we work with Indigenous artists or with people of color, usually the timing and the values as well are different. And we have found as well that most of the fundraisers that we look for or that have the funds to help us, they have a very structured mentality, and I'm going to say very MBA, project management, a wide perspective of your finance have to be in this Excel sheet and you have to bring me this and this in less than 6 months. So it's very fixed, the structures on how the impact is measured, and the project's activities and whoever is leading those activities has the pressure of, I have to have this evaluation and I have to have these results so as to be able to get the rest of the funding, because they usually give you by installments. So I was wondering, in your experience, if you have any case study or if you have this reflection, how can we create or a structure or the way we report, and when I say we, is organizations who are receiving the funding, reports that are more flexible and that are not that fixed in terms of spreadsheets, but maybe something more conversational or something more flexible that can actually, talk more to the methodologies and the processes that we're having in the community.
And feel free, panelists, to just jump in, whoever wants to respond first.
I don't know if this fully answers your question, but I can share a little bit with the kind of reporting kind of frameworks we have at Ignite. So we've intentionally, we work through a fiscal sponsor, so there are kind of some baseline kind of pieces that we have to collect from a sort of from their perspective in terms of being compliant with IRS regulations and that type of thing. But we've tried to instead kind of shift it towards exactly what you were just describing, kind of more of a conversational piece, and actually framed very much as a learning call between us as the intermediary, the donor, and the partner organization. So we've really framed that around our kind of learning around, to what extent really kind of testing we've framed it very much around testing the assumptions and theory of change of the initiative writ large. So kind of trying to kind of build that more partnership dynamic with partners. And then also kind of conversationally kind of understanding kind of what learnings each of us is seeing within the field writ large, because of it as a kind of oriented from a field-based model. So, I mean, it's definitely not perfect, but that's kind of one approach we've taken. And I think if you're thinking more from like how to inform donors around that type of thing, it might be, I guess, a little bit what Heather and Hilesh were describing around kind of a little bit of kind of donor education in terms of, you know, this is what you've asked for, but I actually think you also need to know X, Y, and Z and the kind of wider context that's at play here. And I think over time, they'll kind of see actually the limitations of their reporting templates as a result. I've definitely seen that happen in the past.
Yeah, I would only add to that there's a lot of increased conversations nationally in Chicago, but also internationally about solidarity economies and how that's directly connected to the arts. And I think there is a really good report, and I'll find it and put it in the chat, from Grantmakers in the Arts, which is a collective of like-minded foundations in the United States that is thinking specifically about how to issue reports to shift philanthropy in their thinking about everything from reporting to how you're looking at organizations. And so, and I also think that Grantmakers in the Arts, especially since you're talking about museums, and that model is very connected, and talking about Indigenous artists in particular, would be a great resource to go to, because they also have a lot of talks. And I've sent many of our board members on like rabbit holes, like, you need to watch this talk because these are 4 organizations that are doing massive change, and this is why we should fund them. And I feel like once you have a collective of philanthropy saying like, this is what we're seeing and this is good, then you can kind of, you have more leverage.
That's great. It's the first time that I hear about them, so thank you for sharing that as well.
And
Great,
you know,
everybody.
Hilesh, it's interesting that you say that, because that's a big part of what we try to do as the funders networks. So at Elevate, but also all the other, so many other, not all, I'm not in touch with all of them, but I'm in touch with a lot of the global funders networks. And even like our members are really, really super interested in decolonizing philanthropy, shifting power within philanthropy, figuring out how they can be change agents within their own foundations. And again, it comes back to this fact that there's a lot of information that still needs to flow up. And I love the example that you gave of like, hey, board people, look at this one specific thing. Look at how this is necessary to change that. And so I feel like that's also something cooperatively that we see our member program officers and directors doing with the grantees to help flow that up. So that's often a conversation that if you're on the grantee end, you can have with your program officer, right? Because they might be really open to having that conversation, but be in a system that's still stumbling a bit towards change. And if you can become allies in making that case, then that will help shift change.
Great. Other thoughts or questions, reflections? Oh,
Right.
you just need, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I'm curious about strategies or approaches to helping philanthropy provide the combination of organizational support for members of a network and network support at the same time. I sometimes feel like we're dealing with an either or approach. And to me, it's so obvious that the and is critical, that if these particularly smaller organizations are struggling to pay the bills and hire their staff, they're not able to engage in a network. They're not able to do the bigger work. But yet it always seems like there's some trade-off conversation that ends up at the table.
I have a perspective on that, not from philanthropy, but again, from Girls Not Brides, because that was a big part of internal conversations about how we saw our role as a global network of mostly very tiny organizations in global South countries. And I would think that if I were a program officer in that position or trying to push that conversation, I'd want to be asking the networks what they're doing that the individual organizations can't to support the work of the individual organizations. And and saying, look, that's all you're going to get funded for. But what I've seen in practice, particularly globally, is that because it's easier to move large chunks of money to a larger network organization than many small organizations, sometimes sheer laziness, but sometimes this, like, if you are being told by your board you have to run $300,000 grants, right? Sometimes funders just plop it at a field catalyst or a network organization to end up doing the work or becoming an intermediary. And I feel that that's an unproductive practice within philanthropy, because they should be funding networks to do the network work and not distracting the networks with the doing of the work, saying, what is it that we need to do as a network? And then making the money available, not through the networks, because then they just become a funder, directly to the network members, but being really intentional about those two things. And I can't reflect on like how other foundations are doing that, but I saw that not happening. As like we saw a lot of pressure to actually do the work as Girls Not Brides. And we'd push back on that. And actually ended up creating a fund to fund members directly that wasn't run by us. But that intentionality, I think, is one of the things that funders can also bring in saying, like, what is the real role of a network versus what is the role of the members of the network, and separating those out clearly.
Yeah, I think it also just comes down to, you know, kind of that simple thing of like providing more unrestricted funding. You know, I think at different levels as well, like you say, if the members haven't got the flexibility they need, and they're not resourced in a way that they can engage, it's sort of maybe counterproductive to sort of invest at a network level that's never going to be able to kind of be network led, but be member led. Sorry. So I hear you. I think there's still, I feel like there is a shift, at least from my perspective. I think there's a huge shift within philanthropy of a move towards more kind of unrestricted core funding across the board. But yeah, I think there's still lots to be done, and I think that would help towards what you're describing, that dynamic.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has shifted a lot of conversations around unrestricted or general operating funding and the necessity of that, because a lot of foundations have been, you know, during the pandemic went into this rapid response mode. And I think the key is which foundations have not left the rapid response mode. Like that tells you a lot about a foundation. I feel like some foundations are like, okay, we're done. Pandemic's done, we're going to go back to the way we were, but other foundations are doing some self-investigation. And so I'm curious about just watching my peers in the Midwest of the United States, who is sticking, you know, who's saying like, actually general operating or unrestricted funding is what we need to continue doing right now. And I bring that up because I feel like that's connected to how funders are looking at that specific issue that you brought up, organizational support and networks. I also think that one of the things that's been successful with our board is separating issue versus place-based, because I want to come back to place-based. So there's a lot of issue-based funding, you know, which I think is linked in many cases to networks. But this idea of place-based, when you're framing the place-based funding as a way to support community or neighborhood economies or place-based economies, then you can make the case that, oh, you have to give the organizational support because this is how you're going to maintain. Like, there's the issue, which has so many like threads and arms. It's like, we're talking about policy, we're talking about advocacy, we're talking about all these different things, but it's really important that you do the organizational support because we have to maintain the economies. And I feel like that was a conversation I was able to have in a different way during the pandemic than I was able to have prior to the pandemic with the boards.
So we just have a couple minutes left, and there was a question or reflection in the chat about hearing more examples of how program officers and more junior staff are pushing for change within their own organizations, and empowering their organizations to actually change. If maybe we could end on that, if we could perhaps share some reflections, and then I'll just wrap it all up at the very last.
So I'll just quickly say I just shared a link in something called the Grant Givers Movement, and that's exactly what you're describing, Rachel. It was really a kind of POs and typically kind of junior mid-level staff members within foundations in the UK coming together and kind of essentially kind of thinking about kind of how they could use kind of their collective voice to push for more change within the sector writ large around things like equitable models around decision making, really kind of pushing things around kind of the racial equity and justice within funding as well. So yeah, I'd encourage you to take a look. It's quite an interesting example of a little network in and of itself, I guess.
I think Hilesh should have the last word because he probably has an actual example. But Rachel, I just want to say I actually hear that all the time too. Also, like our funders groups are really similar. The one thing that I can say is that we did have a member foundation come forward and say that one of the members is a big family foundation. One of the members of the family had just inserted a tiny bit of language around participation. Not even participatory philanthropy, participation in the new strategy. And so the team, the program officers and the team kind of went, cool, and put together this whole task force on participatory philanthropy to come up with a suite of recommendations for implementing it in the new strategy, which I was like, that's smart. So like, I think some of it is like kind of leveraging the moment and the stuff that sneaks in and being quite strategic.
What Heather said, that works for me. But I have tons of specific examples. There's a lot in Chicago in particular. There's a lot of people who want to throw money towards changing philanthropy from the inside. And so they're like, we're going to create positions, we're going to give you tons of money. And I think that's great. But I think there's also a lot of program officers who are burned out, specifically for a lot of reasons, but specifically around the purpose because they are trying to they're saddling the weight of trying to change philanthropy from the inside or change their foundation from the inside. And it's really hard. And so, and I know this has been said before, and I don't want to ignore program officers, but leadership really matters. And I think there's a huge shift in the way really well-known philanthropic foundations are changing leadership and bringing people in who are thinking a little bit more radically or progressive around how not just you run a foundation, but how you, all the internal structures and how you support program officers. And I think getting them on and like in conversation is really good. But the last thing I'll add is that one thing that we're doing in Chicago is there's two groups. There's the Teach-In Tuesday groups, and then there's the Philanthropy Wednesday groups. And there are two levels of progressive. The Teach-In's like, we are all for like radical organizing. We're going to do movement building. And the Wednesday group is let's look at issues and get better informed. And I feel like that's good for philanthropy to like understand issues, but also understand how they can change internally. And that in and of itself is more akin to networks. And so I feel like they're changing their practices.
Okay, on that note, we are going to wrap it up. I just want to share my screen really quickly to tell you what's coming up with Collective Mind. We could be having this discussion forever. I'm so grateful to our panelists, Hilesh, Heather, and Katie. You guys were amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your thoughts, your knowledge, your wisdom, your time. Thank you for all of that. A few things coming up with Collective Mind. Specifically, we are in the middle of a research study on donor funding to networks. And we will be moving into the data collection phase of that from September. There will be opportunities for more discussion like this, internal reflections amongst yourselves within your organizations, et cetera, as we move into that. And some other things coming up, our Networks 101 in a couple of weeks, or next week, I guess it is. And Collective Mind Academy, a new offering with professional development training, starting also from late September. So pay attention to your newsletter out every Wednesday for more information, more details, or get in touch if you would like to. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much again to everyone that was here and to our panelists. A huge, huge thank you. So grateful. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks.